Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Resolution Foundation event called, because our communications team do like a good pun, The Price is Tight. But depending on your age, I should point out that I'm not actually Leslie Crowther or Bruce Forsyth or Alan Carr. This is not a game show. This is, in fact, an event to discuss essential costs and the cost of living, and you are all very welcome in person or online. So today we're going to discuss the cost of living, how that's changed, how low-income families are coping with essential costs, and what policy might do for those costs which have shot up over the last few years. To do this, I'm very pleased to be joined by Claire Moriarty, who is the Chief Executive at Citizens Advice, and also by Peter Level, who is a Deputy Research Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, as well as Lalitha Try, an economist at Resolution Foundation. So to cover that topic today, we will first hear from Lalitha, who will be presenting highlights from a report we are publishing today, which, as ever, you can get from our website. Today's report is part of an 18-month project called Unsung Britain, where we are looking at low to middle income households in the UK and what has changed for them over the past few decades. And the whole project is supported by JPMorganChase, and we're very grateful to them for their help. As ever, you can get involved by going to Slido. The code is essential costs. You can ask questions there, and there will be a poll later on. So I think we will start with Lalitha, who will give us the highlights from today's report.
Thanks, Mike. Before we start, I'd like to thank my co-author, Simon Pittaway, for his work on this report. It's been over 3 years now since Russia invaded Ukraine, and inflation is much lower than it was during its peak of 11%. But as you can see from this chart here, people still really care about it. So last month, 36% of people polled by Ipsos put inflation down as one of their 3 most important issues facing the country, and that's many more than did so before the pandemic. People's main concern about inflation started a few years ago with the sharp rise in prices, but if we step back, we can also see that the proportion of their total non-housing consumption spent on essentials has risen over time, as this chart shows. But low-income households have had the burden on their spending of paying for essentials increase more than high-income households have. The bottom fifth of the income distribution spent 46% on essentials in 2006, which rose to 51% in 2022 to 23. But the top quintile spending on essentials as a share of their total spending has hardly changed, so over the same period, it rose from 38 to 39%. This slant towards spending on essentials is important because the rise in inflation during the cost of living crisis was driven by the rising cost of essentials, specifically energy, which is the purple line in this chart. Food also rose by more than overall CPI during the crisis, and over the longer term, transport prices have also risen by more than average. And that combination of a rising cost of essentials plus low-income families spending a higher proportion of their spending on essentials has meant that the actual rate of inflation faced by low-income families over the past few years is greater than that faced by high-income families. As you can see from the chart on the right here, this meant that the poorest 10% of households experienced a cumulative 3 percentage points inflation rate higher than the richest 10% between 2019 and 2024. And that's something that's not captured by our headline statistics on how real terms incomes have changed in recent years. This inflation slant isn't normal or typical over most years. As the chart on the left shows, over the longer term, inflation tends to be even across the income distribution. In today's paper, we're going to look at 2 elements of essential spending, and those are energy and transport. As I showed you earlier, the cost of living crisis was primarily driven by rising wholesale energy costs. Average bills rose by 71% between 2019 and their peak in 2023. Unsurprisingly, families have been struggling to keep their homes warm as a result of this. And more than 1 in 5 low to middle income people lived in households that were unable to keep their accommodation warm in the year 2022 to 23. Because of the sheer pressure that energy costs put on families that can't afford them, we've been thinking about how policy can help people that can't afford to keep their homes warm. The challenge with any programme that provides support for energy bills is how to target people with the greatest energy need, as well as those on a lower income. In particular, it's not enough to just direct support at lower income families because energy need varies so much. As this chart shows, energy need varies much more within the same income decile than it does across the income distribution. So typical energy use, which is the blue dots on this chart in the richest decile group, is only 11% higher than that of the poorest decile, but within each decile, the 80th percentile of energy use is always 2/3 higher than at the 20th percentile. In our view, the best way to target support towards lower income families and families that need to consume more energy is through a social tariff. What we mean by that is a policy where the unit cost of energy is reduced for certain people so as to target support best on the basis of energy need. People on a low income who aren't on means tested benefits should also be eligible, as restricting support to people on means tested benefits isn't generous enough, especially in a crisis. It should also be government funded, unlike the warm levy on energy bills. Let me show you how a social tariff can be better targeted than existing energy support. So to make things fair, we've shared out the cost of winter fuel payments this year via the eligibility criteria for the warm home discount and for our social tariff design, and we'll compare that to what winter fuel payment support will look like this winter. So as you can see from this chart here, the impact of winter fuel payments is relatively even across the income distribution, because the means test threshold is going to be relatively high from this winter, which means that most pensioners will be eligible for it. The bottom decile is the one that's slightly different here, and that's because there's just not that many pensioners in the bottom decile of the income distribution. When you use warm home discount eligibility, where payments from this year onwards will go towards all households on means tested benefits, this makes support given out much more progressive. But a social tariff can do what the warm home discount can't, which is target support towards people based on their energy usage and make sure that low income households with high energy need receive more support than households with a similar income with lower energy need. Jeremy Hunt actually expressed interest in a social tariff during the energy crisis, but one was never introduced. Although there's less need for a social tariff now than there may have been during the energy crisis, we think that the government should start the work now in consultation with the industry to set up the infrastructure and data sharing necessary to create a social tariff so that it's in place before the next price shock. When thinking about transport costs and policy, we should think separately about private and public transport. We know that high-income households travel the most miles by driving, but also that low-income households travel more miles by driving than by public transport, so it's important to everyone. The costs of running a car have actually been rising at the same rate as incomes for the bottom half, with the exception of car insurance, where prices have spiked post-COVID. Although the recent rise in car insurance costs has been pretty high, they do actually make up less than 5% of spending on private transport in the UK. The government has already created a motor insurance task force, and they should ensure that the car insurance market is working effectively. Over the long term, the net zero transition should reduce the cost of driving, as electric vehicles are cheaper to drive than petrol ones. But to make sure that low-income households aren't left behind by the move to net zero, the government need to increase access to on-street EV charging. We do also need to think about public transport, and that's because bus and rail fares have been rising more quickly than both prices and incomes for the bottom half over the longer term. In the UK, we do luckily have rail cards and concessionary bus passes that reduce the cost of transport for some groups. But concessionary bus passes, which are government funded, don't particularly target support well based on income. So it would be a better use of money to target concessionary bus passes towards people receiving means-tested benefits than giving them to all over 60s, for example, which is the policy in a lot of the UK. So far, I've talked about the ways the government can help to reduce costs, but people's standard of living also depends on their income as well as the essential costs that they face. One important thing we should take from the cost of living crisis is that we need to reform how we uprate benefits to protect low-income families. To make sure benefits keep up with prices, they should be uprated more than once a year when inflation's high. More timely data should also be used for uprating, and that's especially important when inflation is volatile. Stepping back, we do need to return to a situation where benefit uprating is not seen as an option, it's seen as necessary. Benefits have only been uprated by inflation in 8 of the last 15 years, which has reduced the real terms value of basic benefits by 9%. To summarise, concern over inflation and the cost of living does remain high, and that reflects a steady trend towards a higher proportion of spending being spent on essentials, and also a cost of living crisis centred around high energy and food costs. But policy can help with high costs. A social tariff on energy would fairly support people who need help the most, and better targeted concessionary bus passes would also help support people with their public transport costs. More equitable access to electric vehicle chargers would make sure that low-income households aren't left behind by net zero, and better benefit uprating would also make incomes more resistant to price shocks. Strong shared income growth is an essential way to deal with cost of living problems, so the government really do need to prioritise improving living standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Claire, your organisation is obviously at the front line, your bureau, network of bureau, your website, your phone line, definitely been extremely busy during the cost of living crisis. But for the analysts and policy people in the audience, I'm sure we've been using your monthly data briefings. We definitely use those, your data dashboard, and I know you and your colleagues have been thinking also about social tariffs recently. So I'm sure you've got absolutely loads to say. Please do share it all with us.
Lovely, thanks so much, Mike, and it's great to be here. Really interesting to hear Daz's presentation. Lots in there that we recognise. Other things, some things where we would have a slightly different perspective, which is good for these type of conversations. So, very much recognise the picture of a higher proportion of income being spent on essentials. As Mike said, we're doing some work with IPPR and Policy and Practice on social tariffs, and as part of that work, IPPR published a report recently called Essential Potential, which showed that the lowest decile are spending 41% of post-housing costs on a bundle of energy, water, broadband and car insurance, compared to 11% at the middle of the income distribution and 5% for the highest percentile. As your report shows, the increase is highest. So that 41% of post-housing costs is an increase from 33% in 2021-22. So there is that real sense of a big increase. Energy, undoubtedly, part of the picture, and I'll come back to that. But I think, although this report focuses specifically on non-housing costs, I think we see housing costs as being central to those essential costs that people are struggling with, partly because experience is so variable according to your housing tenure. So, if you're in social housing, your rent broadly gets paid. If you're in the private rented sector, you receive a maximum amount, which, to be honest, a lot of the time bears no direct relationship to your rent. And the kind of average that we see, that if people having to top up their rent over and above the local housing allowance, is between £100 and £150. And when you think about a standard allowance for universal credit, which is still only £400 a month, that is wildly out of kilter. So with our debt clients, in the private rented sector spent nearly half, over 49% of their income on rent plus energy. And for people who are in a negative budget, where their income doesn't cover their essential costs, that rises to 60%. That was around 45%, so you've really seen that one go up and stick since the cost of living crisis. Mortgage holders, obviously big spikes in mortgage costs, but actually it's still a lower percentage. The other thing that we are very focused on at the moment is motor insurance, which Latha mentioned. So just between the quarter three of 2022 and 2024, that went up 40%. It's an average of £612, which is substantially more than people are paying for, say, water, which we've often seen focused on more. So again, we did some research in December 2024, 2.6 million people unable to afford car insurance, and 7 million people are only affording car insurance by cutting back on other essentials or borrowing. And obviously, car insurance isn't a luxury for lots of people. If you live in a rural area or if you're working unsocial hours, you pretty much need a car to be able to work. And so if you can't afford car insurance, that means you can't drive, that means you can't work. So it has really big knock-ons. And the issues are exacerbated by individualised risk pricing, which is in practice meaning that the people who can least afford to pay for it are being asked to pay the most, whether that's people on low incomes or people of colour. The motor insurance task force is, it's a potentially will help, but I think what we know, and we see this in other markets, is that you can have a market which is within its own terms effective, but still excludes a whole group of people. So we are trying to talk to the government about how to make sure, through a combination of the Motor Insurance Task Force and the Financial Inclusion Committee, that the specific issue of motor insurance for people on low incomes is being looked at. We have seen food spend fall as a proportion of income, whether that's kind of good news, falling prices, or people just kind of cutting back. It's really hard to know, but certainly the options for product switching, if you are already doing your shopping at among the cheapest ranges, then the options for product switching are fewer. So all of that translates into steady increase in debt that we're seeing. Debt is now about 50% higher for our debt clients than it was in 2022. So 2022 to the present, it's gone up from about 5,800 to nearly 8,800. And energy debt, for obvious reasons, has actually doubled since December 2019. So in terms of the things that can be done about that, we were asked to lead some work as part of the Child Poverty Task Force on costs, and the reality is that child poverty is not kind of different in terms from poverty generally. And so we looked at various of these of the cost issues, and certainly utilities comes out very strongly. The need for social tariffs, the need to have a more comprehensive suite of social tariffs which are kind of coherent, consistent both across different localities and consistent across different sectors, and as far as possible are automatic, so people don't have to jump through lots of hoops to get them. Housing again, comes up as a big issue. Government's promised lots of money investment into social housing, which is great, but that doesn't solve the short-term issue. And then, daily basics, we recommended extension of free school meals. That has been done, but by extending free school meals on the basis of means-tested benefits, you retain the problem that, again, Lalitha highlighted, that around, so things based on means-tested benefits, you will on average, nearly 20% of people on middle incomes will benefit, and about over 30% of people on the lowest incomes won't benefit. So it's quite a blunt instrument. So that issue about targeting is really key. So thinking about more ways of targeting which are more related to people's incomes, and also are not just a kind of flat rate issues, so that you actually look at what people's needs are rather than just trying to do it in very kind of blunt ways. So the warm home discount is a really interesting example. There are some big pros because it is an automatic benefit. 92% of people who are eligible for it receive it automatically. But it is, it's one single amount of £150, which doesn't scale to people's needs, and is also, given where energy bills are at the moment, it is out of kilter with what people need. I think another point about social tariffs is really thinking about uptake. So even if they're available, we know that there are a series of barriers that mean that people don't necessarily access them. Again, as part of the social tariffs work, we published some research in March, which was based on what our advisors see in terms of all the barriers that get in the way. There's kind of like 11 stages where there are barriers to people getting social tariffs. Some of that is, do they know about them? So suppliers could do more. There are built-in disincentives for suppliers to promote their social tariffs in some sectors, like broadband. The social tariff comes directly out of the company's bottom line. So how much incentive is there to encourage customers to apply for something that's just reducing your profits? But then even when people do know about them, the sign-up processes and the amount of personal data that people are being asked to hand over can be a big barrier. So we think in terms of where government intervention is needed on social tariffs, much greater focus on automation, data matching, as Lalitha was saying, reducing the barriers for people to access the support that they're eligible for. We are not big fans of unit price-based social tariffs, say for energy, but banded support, which means that people do get amounts which vary with their needs. Thinking about a new approach in broadband where the level of uptake of social tariffs is really, really low, and coming up with some kind of mechanism. It's difficult in insurance, but for car insurance there needs to be some kind of mechanism that actually enables people to access car insurance. So, quick whistle-stop tour.
Thank you very much, Claire. And Peter, your work is on the economics of household spending.
Really interesting report, Lalitha and Simon. It's a really interesting read, and it's timely, not just in the sense that inflation is running really high at the moment, as you say, so inflation rates have come down, but of course we're still living in the era of high prices. That's the result of that inflation. And also, while we're not kind of in an emergency at the moment, we're clearly in a volatile world where these sort of shocks can happen, and sort of having these discussions now, thinking about these things in advance, is great that people are doing that, because so that we're situated well when the next kind of crisis inevitably happens. So I had really two thoughts about the report. The first is some of the importance of data. So there's an extensive discussion of data in the report. It's based on these budget surveys that we have to see what people are spending their money on. So it's kind of clear early on in the report that it's actually quite ambiguous what's happened to living standards for different groups over the last 5 years. So we're quite good at measuring incomes, and if you just use income with a standard deflator, you'd see that actually the higher income households have seen larger decreases in their living standards and their real incomes over that period. But what's really clear is that because it's essentials that have seen the largest price increases, that picture changes very substantially when you have household level deflators that sort of account for the fact that lower income households spend much more on energy, and energy prices have gone up so much. So it's really important to have the right data there to understand what's going on living standards. It's really important to have data on what's happening on the spending side of what households are doing as well as the income side. And it's really difficult to do that when you have a response rate to the household budget surveys, which is around 20% now, which is much lower than the low rates we had even a few years ago. In this current crisis, our research shows that even these household level deflators that the ONS is now publishing very helpfully, they have their own limitations, which is that the surveys are not so detailed that you can tell the difference. You can see how much more low-income households are spending on, say, bread than high-income households. But actually within the category of bread, there were actually quite substantial differences in prices. So some work I did with colleagues at the IFS looked at supermarket prices, and we saw that most of the inflation was particularly concentrated amongst the cheaper brands of these items. And that's not going to be reflected even in these household level measures. So the first thing is kind of, do we really know what's happening to living standards if we don't know what's happening to, if we don't have the kind of detailed measures what's going on prices, and we don't connect that detailed data on what's going on with household budgets. And that to me is kind of worrying. The second thought I had was just about how you deliver support in general. So when we know people are struggling, the standard kind of economics textbook prescription is, you want to support people on low incomes, you deal with the fact they have low incomes. So you provide more income support, you provide cash transfers, and you do it in a way that preserves people's freedom to spend the money on what they want to spend it on. You don't decide what that is yourself. You don't distort prices in a way that will encourage consumption of some things versus other things. You just deliver cash in a way that doesn't change incentives. So we did some other research, again, with colleagues at IFS, that was looking at the recent energy price crisis and how we delivered support during that crisis. And we started off with, I think, that view that the government had stepped in and put enormous subsidies on energy prices. And we can measure in the data that this really, the people were very responsive to prices. So the fact that you held prices down meant people were consuming more energy. And each pound of energy, each pound they spent on energy was bringing in 64p of government subsidies. So it was very expensive if households didn't have an incentive to cut down their energy consumption. And of course, the subsidy applied; it was blanket. It was rich and poor had the same subsidy, and that meant you had less money to support people in other ways. So on that grounds, you might want to focus more on things like the energy rebates and other transfers of that kind that don't really distort incentives in the same way. But within that, there's this problem that Lalith mentioned, that the income is not a very good guide to how much people's energy costs are. There's enormous variation in people's energy costs even within income groups. Some people live in drafty homes, some people are disabled, some people have to spend a lot of time indoors. And so there's a lot of variation in energy needs that's really difficult for the government to see. And that was one of the motives for this energy price subsidy. So although it's blanket, it's rich and poor alike, you can be sure you're going to reach those households with high energy needs. So we had to kind of step back from this kind of purist textbook case of just give people income transfers. If you can't target those income transfers based on need, then you might need a subsidy as well. So that being said, we thought, we did the numbers, and we thought if you targeted energy support a bit differently, you'd put more weight on the transfers, you brought more information into the system so you could work out more about what people's energy needs were. You could have achieved roughly the same sort of goals while saving £5 billion, or alternatively, you could have spent those £5 billion on greater energy support. So it's kind of so it's sort of interesting to have this discussion of how you deliver support and how you deliver support in the case where the government doesn't perfectly observe people's needs, things get a bit more blurry than the kind of textbook case. So I'm going to stop talking now. And
no, thanks very much, Peter. That's perfect. Okay, great. So a reminder that you can go to Slido and the code is essential costs. If you're in the room, we will have a microphone, or you can use Slido as well. Just before we start, Claire, you touched on housing. I mean, heaven forbid Resolution Foundation doesn't do an event where we don't talk about the cost of housing. We should have explained up front, and probably it was Lalitha's modesty that prevented us from doing so, but we in our big project, we covered housing elsewhere. So Lalitha has a great report from earlier this year where we essentially think of housing as, it's like a tax on income. So that's gone already. We've done housing, and today's report is about what's left once you've paid for your housing. But of course, housing is the biggest essential of all, and the costs there are rising too. And yes, we agree that support is not keeping up. Okay, so I guess maybe we should start a bit by talking about why costs have gone up or down over the last few years, and then I'd like to touch on differential inflation again, and then later on, for the final bit of today, we'll talk about the policy options and social tariffs. But Peter has given us an incredibly clear discussion of the pros and cons. Peter and Claire gives a very clear discussion of the pros and cons. So I'm going to start by being optimistic. So we're often a bit gloomy at Resolution Foundation, and we are about to talk about things getting more expensive. But there was a good chart that Lalitha showed us towards the beginning, which of course shows us that not everything is getting more expensive. Some things are getting cheaper. It's worth pausing on that. So Lalitha showed us that clothes, electronic goods, obviously, and also food are all things which in the UK have been getting either getting cheaper or are getting expensive only very slowly. And indeed food, the UK does tend to have relatively cheap food compared to other European countries, primarily we think due to strong competition and efficiency and efficient supermarkets. So capitalism isn't all that bad, is it? Peter, any thoughts on that? But also
on capitalism.
Yes, any thoughts on capitalism?
Yes, so that's kind of that's kind of interesting. So I mean, I once so there was this chart on social media that someone in America had done, which is the price of everything, the long run price of everything. So they just had the CPI categories in the US, and you can see, so in the US, kind of healthcare and tuition fees were shooting off, but electronics and mainly electronic goods like cameras and TVs and things have become much cheaper. And so on a rainy Sunday afternoon, I did that for the UK. And for the UK, it's a little different. I mean, obviously medical costs are not such a big issue here, but I mean, really, it's energy, and so there's obviously the last 2 years when they shot up, really, energy prices. But there's been really kind of a long run kind of pressure on energy prices, partly through policy. And so over the last, I can't remember, 15, 20 years, those two categories really stand out as the electricity and gas as the ones that have gone up most in price, and food has kind of got a bit cheaper. And then clothing and electronics have fallen a lot, as Mike and Lalitha were mentioning. I suspect part of this is globalization, rise of China as a major export powerhouse producing all these goods for us. What's happening to globalization? I think there's signs that there's going to be onward pressure on those prices. So energy prices, we're talking now about kind of grid upgrades, and they'll be very expensive, and how we're going to pay for them. And it's likely that a lot of that is going to be shifted onto energy bills or energy bill payers. So there's that kind of pressure that's going to be going on in the future. And then we've been, in the report, it mentions a great deal about water. Again, we need to upgrade the infrastructure. How we're going to pay for that, we're going to shift it onto bill payers. So we want it to be optimistic, but there's some grounds for kind of pessimism in the price of essentials, I think, going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Claire, go, please, Claire.
I mean, I think the thing that we're interested in is the differential effect of inflation across different categories. So the household costs index, which looks at how costs vary for different deciles. Again, and what you see there is that, generally speaking, for the reasons you were talking about before, Peter, inflation is higher for people on essentials for people at the lower end of the income spectrum, partly because the impact, so if you're buying a packet of pasta for £2.80 and it goes up to £3, well, that's quite a small increase, and in any case you can choose to buy some other pasta which doesn't cost £2.80, but if you're buying the 20p pack of pasta and it goes up to 40p, that is a 100% increase, and you probably don't have any options of what you switch to because there is nothing cheaper. And so in that, again, picking up Lanitha's point about benefits and inflation increases of benefits, we would love to see benefits linked to HCI in a way that reflects the categories of people who are receiving them, rather than a generalised sense, which is where the level of inflation, particularly on some of these things like food and probably clothes as well, because you have the same thing with a very, very large spectrum of possible prices and a category of people who are concentrated in buying the cheapest products because that's what they can afford, and where everything is much stickier.
Mm. In the report you thought about whether benefits should be linked to the ONS's indices, and in the end decided maybe not quite yet, but just want to explain the logic, our reasoning.
Yeah, essentially we did have a real think about that, and in theory it would be really good to link benefit uprating to household cost indices for, so as to reflect the inflation rate that people on those benefits face. However, that data at the moment, it's only published quarterly, so it's produced at a lag, so you might end up sort of exacerbating the problem we have at the moment, where you have to use, September's rate of inflation is used for benefit uprating in April, so there'd probably still be a bit of a gap between the inflation used and when benefits are uprated. And it would definitely be great if the ONS were to publish, that exact data and to make it more frequent, but, things maybe aren't going so well for them at the moment. And we also thought there might be potentially some sort of political challenges with getting that through. So if you were to use HEIs for benefit recipients to uprate benefits, that would be something different to what normally happens with personal tax thresholds. They're frozen at the moment, have been for a while, but they normally go up by CPI inflation each year. And so you might struggle to sort of get political and public support for that. But we think in theory it would be a decent idea.
Feels like a wonk will definitely design a tax benefit system where you have different measures of inflation doing different things, but we did worry slightly that whether the public understanding as yet is enough to sustain that. I'll come to a question shortly.
Just on that point, I think the political challenge is absolutely huge, because we know there's a whole lot of work needed to kind of improve understanding of the value of social security, and the idea, because HCI would almost always, for the categories of people we're talking about, be higher than CPI for all the reasons we've said. So, politically trying to get the public to accept a higher increase in the percentage of uplift for benefits, when on the whole, as you've said, the pressure has been downward. So I think that is a real problem. I think the time lag thing, as I understand the time lag thing, is mainly a practical issue, that the DWP's computer systems are so old for the legacy benefits that it takes them that long to reprogram them with the new number. And they are they are rolling off legacy benefits. And if the DWP cannot in the medium term get to a point where it can plug in a number, as it can for universal credit, they can change things on a sixpence. It is the legacy benefits, which mean everything takes 6 months. That's a real problem in its own right. It needs to be fixed.
Great. Did you have a comment relevant to these points?
Yes, well,
Hang on a second, we'll just let you give the microphone. If you could say who you are and where you're from.
I'm Jill Leyland, and I work a lot on inflation measurement, including HCIs, which the starting point, yes, you know. So I do have a bit of an interest in them. There's no reason why they can't be published more frequently. The cost would not be huge for ONS. There would be a cost, to be fair. I think I'm slightly worried that they're not going to be considered as core statistics under the new regime that we just saw published last week, but that's a thing. But the other point is that they adjust for the sort of different weights, the fact that lower income households spend more on energy, food, etc., as a proportion of their spending. They don't yet look at the prices of different brands. So the cheapflation that we've definitely seen, and not just in the UK, in other countries too, is not yet included. And I think that's a challenge that's got to be addressed. And well, with pressures on ONS's budgets, I don't see that happening soon. Although it has been looking at it, to be fair.
Thank you very much. And just go on, stick with the ONS. I mean, Peter, you said quite rightly that the measures of inflation, the HCIs, they measure bread, the price of bread, but the ONS has said it will be using much more rich fine grain data from people's actual. I mean, are you optimistic? Do you think there's a potential for improvement there?
Well, yes. So there's potential improvement in the price survey, so
right.
The measurement
Yes.
of prices. So in the sense that they're collecting all this data from supermarkets, so they'll have millions of observations. They'll be able to publish much more detailed indices and so on. What the challenge is to connect that to the budget data to actually put a number on how much is the cost of living rising for these different groups. Yeah. And that's the bit that's going to be much harder because they're not within their pipeline of data coming in. That's not something that's there.
Okay, very good, thank you. And I had another question on differential inflation, which I think I'll start with Peter. But I mean, Lalitha showed us the chart for the last 5 years. There's been a big distributional skew with low-income households facing higher inflation, high incomes. But that's really not always the case. That's not an immutable fact of life, is it?
No.
And I think it's something that your IFS colleagues have looked at as well.
Yes. So we used to kind of, when the IFS were the only people that had the technology to do this, was to take the living cost and food survey and do this differential inflation analysis and see how the cost of living was changing for these different groups. And a lot of the time we were finding sometimes it was lower income groups had lower inflation because maybe mortgage interest costs were predominantly affecting higher income households or whatever it was. So it's not an immutable fact of life, and that's also one of the, when it comes into the politics of how you operate these things. On the one hand, you might have to worry about a case where you have systematically higher inflation for some groups, and that means it's more expensive to do it in that way. On the other hand, sometimes it will be higher, sometimes it will lower, and sometimes there might be years where actually you're increasing benefits at a rate lower than the headline rate of inflation, and how are people going to react to that? That's another communication and political question.
Yep. Great, thank you. I think we'll move on to some of the policy solutions, which broadly speaking is a social tariff where it comes to energy. So I might start with Claire. I mean, Peter's given us the economic theory, or it's in general it is ideal if you could target incomes, not costs. But it's clear your organisation is very keen on social tariffs in a number of areas.
Well,
So does that reflect the fact that actually government is not very good at redistributing income, and so for goodness sake do something, or is there more to it than that?
No, I think I think it would always be better for people to be in a position where they had enough income to be able to pay for their essential costs. So effectively, all of the other things, social tariffs are a kind of failure solution, but we are stuck in a world where incomes are not covering people's essential costs, and the political challenge of having in this country of having social welfare at a level that it actually supports people, does what it says on the tin, is massive. As illustrated by the fact for people who come to us for debt advice, 50% of them are in a negative budget, which means that after our advisors have done everything they can to maximise income and support people with budgeting, their income does not cover their essentials. Now that's a huge number, and we did some work a couple of years ago to kind of extrapolate that and take the underlying methodology and apply it at a kind of national level, and that came up with 5 million people living in households with a negative budget and 2.5 million people who were only not in a negative budget because they were cutting back to unsafe levels. So fixing the income issue has to be, that's the centre of the bullseye, and then all of the other things that we look at are really just ways of trying to mitigate the problem that isn't going to come anytime soon. So social tariffs and then within the category, so social tariffs trying to reduce people's costs in some of these areas which, as we've been talking about, are under the most pressure, is a way in which we can kind of mitigate the problem through another route, and then then trying to look at the way which does that most effectively, that kind of gets it. And that's when you get into targeting and how do you get the right amount of money to the people who need it in a way which actually gets to enables people to benefit, because there are quite a lot of broadband is a fascinating example where there is theoretically there is a social tariff in broadband. There are large numbers of people who could benefit from it who are not getting it. So the gap between the theoretical existence of a social tariff and people actually having the benefit is large as well.
Yeah, right. There's a big difference between something like the Warms Home discount, and we can dispute whether that's social tariff or not, but it's essentially a near automatic passporting that you get from getting certain benefits, which turns it into money off your bill
and usage. But it is benefits and usage, that one.
Yeah. And then on the other side, we've got schemes run by telecom companies or water companies, which are sort of all done by the companies, lots of hoops to jump through, maybe hidden, no national scheme.
Yeah.
So these are. The phrase social tariff is used to describe what at the moment are a really large variety of different kind of schemes. Okay, focusing on energy, somebody's asked a question which I think all three of our speakers have asked about energy need. I can read the question out. So the question was, how do we define and measure energy need? And I think, Peter, you started to touch on that in your bit. Why don't you start? I mean, Why do we say a need for energy rather than use, and what is special about energy that means we need to think about the fact that different households use different amounts?
Yes, this is a very philosophical question. What we did in the report in our work was we sort of judged people's energy needs based on their historic energy usage.
Right.
So if we saw people in the past, before this shock even happened, using more energy, then we said, okay, well, this is these people with high energy needs. This is going to mix up. Just from a data point of view, this is going to mix up people who we think might have a deserving need for energy because they have to spend a lot of time at home, but also people who just have preference for a very warm home, or so people who have a preference for high energy, which maybe would be less inclined to kind of compensate people for. So yes, you sort of have to go to the kind of roots of the issues, disability benefits help people with disabilities. So if that's a cause of energy needs, then ideally you should be distributing through that system rather than through the energy market.
Right. And then in your report, Lalitha, the chart you showed, that was based on the English Housing Survey, where they're sending surveyors into people's homes and actually trying to measure what you would need to spend in order to keep you to warm your home and do your cooking. So that's different from use, isn't it? And
yes, exactly. So to give you an example, you can have a family of the same size, of the same income, that happen to need to spend different amounts on energy. So, if you could have one family where they're living in a really well insulated home, they've got a great EPC rating, but you could have another family where they're living in a really drafty home, they're renters, so they can't do anything about that, they can't, improve the insulation, they might have electric heating, so they have to spend more to get the same amount of, warmth from that energy. They don't really have a choice. So that's something we thought was really important to take into account.
I think we put the figures in a different report, but especially if you look at low-income households, you've got a high fraction who are in social rented or private rented, and so who can't directly control the energy efficiency of their property. And we all know that private landlords are not exactly, jumping at the bit to insulate their homes.
Yes, there is clearly, there are all sorts of correlations, and it's really difficult because some people, there is a category of people who have very high energy use because they have swimming pools and lots of electric cars, and they are not. But an income, something that looks at income, will kind of screen them out likely. But numbers of families, numbers of children, older people, health conditions. But as you say, interesting question about the intersect of what is it which bit of the system is helping people with the additional costs, but energy efficiency makes a huge difference. If you're in a low energy efficiency home, a third of your entire energy bill is just going on heating the sky and the air outside, and the as you say, the ability to, if you have no control over how efficient or inefficient, or whether you've even got the right type of heating system, type of energy supply that matches your heating system. So there are a lot of issues, but you can. I mean, if you're looking at, as we're here concerned about people on low incomes, it's a bit easier to make the assumption that people are probably not just by choice spending lots of money on energy, on higher energy, higher usage of energy because they fancy it. That is going to be more likely. Your perverse incentives, which are definitely true, are going to be, I would have thought, a rising problem as you get up the income spectrum.
Yep, definitely. Yep. So, so energy to us feels different from food. Say, I mean, food expenditure. We're not talking about having a social tariff for food or giving out food vouchers widely. That's probably because food expenditure is pretty well related to the size of your household, and that's something that the benefit system can capture very well. Whereas energy just feels different. And I think, Peter, your work is really clear at showing that one. So I think that's why we're talking about energy, and that's why we can think about energy need. Now let's go to the income side of the equation. And I think what we're taking from the last few years is that a scheme that's limited just to those on means-tested benefits is probably not going to cut it if we go back to an energy crisis. And our kind of 2 points of evidence of that are, number one, Liz Truss and the energy price guarantee, but then number two, look at what happened when the current governments tried to cut back into fuel payments to those on benefits. But where do you stand, Claire? Where does your organisation stand? I mean, for us, a social tariff has to be more than just people on means-tested benefits.
Yes, and I think, as you say, what the energy crisis showed really starkly was the difference between the tools that the government had at its disposal and the things that you actually needed to be able to support the people who were in need. So the only things really that they had were the completely blanket, the energy bill support scheme, and then the cost of living payments, which were targeted on people on means-tested benefits, because the government has their names, addresses and bank details, and it's easy to do. There was that little thing they tried to do with the council tax, but that wasn't...
Less said the better.
Yeah, exactly. So it was quite clear at the start of the energy crisis when the EBSS came in that they needed to, they were basically buying themselves time to be able to come up with something which was more effective, but they didn't. And there have been, certainly all of that time, there have been discussions in government and with government about how they could use the massive amount of data they've got to do the data matching which would enable people to be targeted more effectively. It's for reasons which I half understand, having spent a long time in government, and half I'm just gobsmacked by. It turns out to be very difficult to make progress, but there absolutely needs to be mechanisms to target people, because we see, the mismatch of the people in the lowest income deciles with the people who are on means-tested benefits just points to the need to be able to target people more effectively.
And do you think the government has set a precedent now with the way it's removing winter fuel payments from richer pensioners? Does that show any promise?
Well, it's quite interesting. Again, go back to the start of the energy crisis when the argument was always, well, we just can't do anything to do with incomes. There was already the high income child tax thing, the thing that takes away your child benefit if you're above a certain level. So, it's a good and a bad example. It's an example of you can do it, and they do it. But it's incredibly clunky, and it doesn't work at a household level. So, my simplistic understanding is they basically reached for the same mechanism to kind of income cap the winter fuel payment. Again, it is possible to do. It's not a very sophisticated mechanism, but it is better than what they've as a mechanism. I'm not sure that as a decision it's the best decision, but as a mechanism they have demonstrated that they used it once and they're prepared to use it again.
Thank you. And in the project you're doing on social tariffs, do you see it as your job to solve some of the data issues and data sharing issues, or is it just, come on government, get on with it, you've got all the information?
Well, I think there's different sets of data issues. So there are some issues to do with, which is essentially to do with the ability to use HMRC data, because they are the people who are sitting on the income data, and the issues about how other departments join up their data with HMRC data. That is something which can only be resolved within government, and so all of the rest of us can do is kind of keep pointing to it. There are some other quite interesting data questions about how the data that companies have can be put together with different sorts of local, very, very local data about people's incomes to target people. So as part of the social tariffs project, policy and practice in particular, they are running a number of experiments with local authorities and with water companies, which are taking the kind of the behavioural economics of uptake in different, trying out different things. Because the basic, some of the simplest things, like if you apply for a social tariff in one area, can you automatically be first nudged and encouraged, and then potentially just kind of flipped over into applying for other things. So there are ways in which data can be used by lots of different people, but that fundamental question about incomes is going to sit with government.
Thank you. Peter, I guess your work probably didn't think about so much of those operational issues about exactly how to make a social tariff work.
On the sort of energy work. Yes, so we weren't kind of thinking about the sort of technical aspects of. I was paraphrasing earlier when I said based on energy need, based on historic energy usage. We used actually the particular scheme of thing was both using income and energy use data to kind of target these things better. Okay. But yes, it was kind of a bit slightly maddening. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, so you had a full year to prepare for what we all knew was coming, which is this period when people would need support. And the fact that we were still using this antiquated way of operating benefits, so that when there's a big shock to inflation, people don't get fully compensated for it, and the fact that we didn't have the kind of instruments needed to target this kind of support, when we know that data sits in government, it just needs to be connected together, and we're talking billions of pounds of savings or public money. It was surely worth resources, investment to kind of get these things operational. Yes. That's my only thought on that.
And I think Lalitha said it in quite a mild-mannered way, but we were feeling quite frustrated about the fact that the previous government did say, as we came out of the energy prices, Jeremy Hunt said, we should really look at a social tariff so that we don't waste so much money as we did with the energy price guarantee. The civil servants started work, and then what it seems from the outside is as soon as energy prices went back down to a more manageable level, the civil servants were like, no need to bother. Or maybe the politician said, no need to bother. But as Peter says, as Lalitha said in the report, this is absolutely the time when we must work out how to do a social tariff, build the infrastructure now, so that when the next emergency happens, the civil servants can whip out the scheme and we're ready to go, and we're not either scrabbling around trying to make something up on the spot like we did in the pandemic, or spending billions of pounds when we don't need to, as Peter's work has highlighted. At this, I'd want a quick question on water, where I think more people are talking about a social tariff. Claire, can you possibly remind us what the government's thinking and saying on this at the moment? They did.
Yeah, so at the moment, water social tariffs they are within each company, so effectively within a geographical area, because that's how water works. So whereas energy is a single system across the whole of the country, and it is levy funded, it's funded by levy on consumers, but it's kind of harmonised across the whole of the country. Each individual water company essentially assesses what its customers are prepared to pay to support other customers, and then puts its own scheme in place. There has been talk for a long time about a single social tariff across water, and the government, that's what the government is now. I think the water something measures bill act, I can't remember where it's got to, so they are starting to do some work on that. It will run into, of course, all of the issues about, are my customers going to be paying for your customers, which is, I think, the reason why the system is the way it is at the moment, is because no one has wanted to address kind of redistribution across different parts of the country, which is what it comes down to. But I think that's the direction that things are moving in.
Thank you. But water bills, of course, are a tiny fraction much smaller than energy bills.
Yeah, that's definitely true that water bills, at least in the data that we have, the latest data is 2022 to 23, and it's a lot smaller of a proportion of people's spending compared to energy bills. It is definitely the case that water bills went up quite a lot this year, and they are set to go up in the years ahead. So that, water will start to become more of a burden on household spending. But I think sort of compared to energy, it's still going to be a lot smaller, and there's still going to be sort of less variation within that as well.
Thank you. And I've just spotted a question which is relevant to both water and energy, which I could have asked, the one about cliff edges, where somebody's asked, should we be worried that any kind of income-based social tariff will then lead to, might well end up with a large cliff edge at the end, where if you earn a pound more to be eligible, you fall off, and then suddenly your energy bill goes up by whatever, £300, disincentives and all that. Peter, you yes, sure this is bread and butter for the IFS.
Yes, no, exactly. I think the question really raises the sort of dangers of piecemeal thinking,
right?
Of sort of taking in each market in isolation. I was like, okay, water bills are going up, so how can we deal with that? Well, we'll have a system where every water company has its own system for a social tariff, and and then energy bills are going up, so how are we going to think about that? Well, we need to think about how to those levied in a fair way, rather than looking at the system as a whole, because the more you do things piecemeal, the more you end up with cliff edges, bizarre incentives, companies organising things, a whole load of hoops for people to jump through, individual consumers to jump through, schemes that differ across different areas. So you end up with a whole load of unfairness and inefficiency if you focus things individually rather than look at the system as a whole and say what incentives do people have as a whole, what's happening to living standards, the cost of distribution as a whole, and how do we distribute income where it's needed. It's quite easy to fall into, though, because every debate is kind of siloed, right? We suddenly talk about what are we going to do about water bills, and what are we going to do about energy bills, rather than the cost of essentials as a whole, which is what this report kind of is good at looking at, thinking about more systematically.
Claire?
I think I absolutely agree. I mean, it underlines, for one thing, the problem of doing it through the cost side rather than the income side, because you do end up having to do something in lots of different sectors rather than saying, how do we make sure that people actually have enough money to live off? I think the other thing which is a real issue is, at the moment, an awful lot of things hang off means-tested benefits, and therefore, in reality, a very large number of things hang off universal credit. So, there's universal credit itself. There's a whole lot of passported benefits, including childcare, which is, the childcare allowance, because childcare is expensive, is massive. And then a lot of the social tariffs at the moment, the eligibility is defined by being on universal credit. They've now, that the warm home discount is going to be universal credit, free school meals are going to be universal credit. So there are huge cliff edges. So in a sense, the cliff edge problem that might be created by linking it to income is probably not even touching the sides of the existing cliff edge problem, which doesn't seem to be very much, it's not talked about as much as you might expect.
No, it didn't. Well, the government are doing the review of universal credit at the moment. Stephen Timms is leading that as well. When he's not doing the PIP review, he's going to be very busy in the next few months. When he asked a group of experts, what are the main work incentive problems with universal credit, we all didn't say it's universal credit. We all said it's the things that are linked to universal credit and the cliff edge at the end. So yes, but you're right. It does get much less attention. I realise I haven't given other people in the room a chance to ask any questions, but I know there aren't very many of you, but you are also welcome to ask anything. That's fine. If not, okay, that's good. Well, you're all. Let's move on to the poll, and the poll is really. We've gone for a really short, sharp, snappy one this time. So again, go to Slido, essential costs, and you can vote in the poll. And I guess I wanted to just touch on the politics of it, where we are here, and also maybe touch on this. What we've just been getting onto is the distinction between should the government be thinking about helping families through the cost of living issues by targeted measures to do with cost of living support, or should they be thinking about incomes? And I suppose there's also a question about does it need to do something now, or should it be playing the long game? I mean, if you take Labour take their manifesto at face value, what they said a year ago, their strategy was growth as a way of getting shared living standards, shared growth in living standards, widespread prosperity that way. But I know they also are very conscious about the cost of living and they look at the US, where it was widely reported that inflation is what meant that President Biden lost. So I think they feel pressure also to do something, perhaps high profile or very salient on the cost of living. So the question for the audience is whether they should. And our panellists also get the same kind of question, but also feel free to reflect on this issue about whether the government should, short-term pressures versus long-term focus on growth and widespread changes in living standards. Peter, do you want to go first?
Remind me what the question is, sorry.
Well, I mean, you can answer that question if you like.
Question.
But I would also, but within that question is also, where do you think where should the government's priorities be? Short-term focus on cost of living pressures, or long-term focus on how to get growth back and actually some living standards growth?
I think. Do you mind if I spend some more time to think about it?
Of course. Claire.
I think I probably couldn't answer the question other than yes. On the basis of the level of need that is existing in among groups of people at the moment, as I say, we are still seeing our people come to us for a debt advice. 50% of them are in a negative budget. We have seen, in our data, we have seen a slight tailing off of some of the kind of key, what we classify as cost of living elements. So energy has gone down a bit, but there is no sense that everything's settled down and people are in a kind of good position. Things like the number of food bank referrals, which is one of the kind of key elements of crisis support. These things are still at a high level, and so I think there is still strong evidence that a lot of people are really, really struggling. So in whatever way it's done, again, you come back to, ideally, rather than a sort of blob of let's do some cost of living support, it would be actually fixing the bones of the social welfare system, but that's difficult. Failing that, it would be things which are kind of properly thought through schemes. So I think it's a yes and what's the best way of doing it. I think the growth question is interesting because there is a bit of an assumption that kind of we're back in the kind of classic trickle down growth. When the government talks about growth, they tend to be thinking about investment, productivity and things which are going to take some time to produce the right kind of impact, and we'll still need political decisions to get the money that is generated by growth into the pockets of the people who need it most. There's a bit of a tendency as well to have the kind of the false dichotomy if it's either growth or it's consumers. So one of the other arguments we are trying to put forward is that actually consumer protections are an important part of growth, because if people don't have the confidence to go out and buy things, then you're not going to get any growth in any event. So I think there's that, that it all still feels very unstable. We've managed to get through the whole of this without mentioning disability benefit cuts, but they are still there, and the concessions that the government has made are not going to resolve the problem for issue. So I think, to the extent that this is is the cost of living still a big problem? Yes. And does the government need to do something about it? Yes.
Thank you. And actually, one of the audiences asked a question which almost lies behind this one, and the question they asked was, why is the government acting like the cost of living crisis is over when you show it's not? But do you? I said in my preamble I thought the government was concerned about the cost of living. Do you think they are? Do you think they get it? Or do you think they are concerned?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I think they are concerned, and we keep being told there's going to be a kind of cost of living moment. I'm not quite sure what's going to be in the cost of living moment, and clearly, they are being pushed on. Some of the things on which they've had to concede are kind of underlying issues about cost of living. There is definitely this kind of narrative of we've moved on from the cost of living crisis. So I'm not sure how much of it is semantics. They are clearly worried, but they're not. It's all reactive, and it's only really even the reactive stuff is only happening when in response to backbench rebellion. So it lacks a kind of strategic sense of what would you do to put all of this on a better footing.
Great, thank you. Lala, do you want to have a go at the question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's support that the government should be announcing at the autumn budget, which you might not technically think of as cost of living support, but it's things that would definitely help with the cost of living. So we're expecting a child poverty strategy to happen around the autumn. They should definitely be getting rid of the 2-child limit, first off. That's extremely important. And then I think in terms of things that we've talked about today, I certainly think the government could announce introducing a social tariff at the autumn budget, because the thing about that is, as Claire said, it is quite hard to set up the infrastructure to put a social tariff in place. So if they're worried about sort of spending lots of money in, next year, for example, it would take a lot of work, and it might take, a few years to sort of put a social tariff in place. So that's something where they could announce it, they could do the work, and then they'll be ready to support people if we have another energy crisis.
Right, yeah, so they definitely should get on and get the social tariff built. We've said that. Yep, that's very clear. But you also mentioned the child poverty strategy with 2-child limit. So you've gone from cost of living support to incomes. So I think that's really that's kind of what we're getting at with the question here, Peter. Is really, do you think the government should do something? Should the government do something about cost of living support, or should it just be worrying about incomes overall?
Yes, So I think I can see the danger. There's a danger here that when you start talking about cost of living support as opposed to living standards or income support, you immediately fall into this kind of piecemeal approach of like each bill treated separately. We need to bring down energy bill, we need to bring down water bills. You start messing with prices. You start introducing all these schemes, temporary schemes that are all individual and all need to apply for, that might be managed by different people. And so I can see a risk of this kind of framing. That kind of said, like the political incentives, they're a little odd in a way because, some people took the lesson over the last, from the American election, that voters just really hate inflation. So over and above what's happening to their real incomes, their inflation-adjusted incomes, they just hate the fact that the price of things have changed, and that's kind of dizzying and unsettling, and they just don't like it, or that they can fixate on particular prices and blame politicians for those, whereas even if living standards themselves might be they're not, but were kind of rising. So I can sort of see that this frame, there's dangers in this sort of way of framing the question, as opposed to just how are people doing at different parts of the income distribution, how are different groups doing, what's happening to their real living standards, what they can afford in general with their whole budgets.
Yeah, great, thank you. Let's see what the 30 of you who replied think. Okay, that's a clear majority. Yes, you'd like some funded cost of living support this autumn. Well, we'll see. I mean, we're definitely expecting a child poverty strategy. We're obviously we're expecting the Chancellor to return to her, see how where our fiscal rules have got to. But I think there will also be continued political pressure to be doing something, to be seen to be doing something, or to be doing something about cost of living. So we will see. Thank you all very much for listening. It turns out that on a very hot day, sitting here in front of 2 really bright lights is not the best thing to do. So well done to the 4 of us for getting through that. And thank you all for listening.